Early in the March of 2003, police in Beijing were informed of a body discovered lying dead on the banks of the Yongding River. Arriving at the scene, investigators observed a male victim who'd been subjected to a frenzied brutal attack. The discovery brought the body count of men who'd died in a similar manner up to 5 in the past couple of months. A little more than a week later, the figure rose to 6. A mother, who had lost contact with her adult son, visited his home to look for him. Entering her son's home, she was greeted with the horrifying sight of his decomposing body, tied up on the floor of the apartment. The victim had endured a vicious assault, been mutilated, and their genitals removed. The grim discoveries had started in late January. A 23-year-old man, identified under the pseudonym Wu Xiaogang, was found dead in his apartment with multiple knife wounds to the back. In what would become a disturbing calling card, the victim had their genitals removed, the parts later found discarded in a garbage dump adjacent to the apartment, seemingly thrown out of a window. A 27-year-old male, referred to under the pseudonym Liu Gui, was found dead in his home, just days later. This time the victim was forced to endure a sustained, drawn-out assault. The victim had been bound with rope, very much in a manner that resembled bondage play, and had numerous injuries inflicted on his naked body. They included burns, shallow cuts, bruising from blunt force trauma. The genitals were removed, the cause of death this time due to the victim having his throat sliced open. The third victim, identified by the pseudonym Luo Jun, was 29 at the time of his death, his body also discovered in his home. He'd been subjected to multiple injuries from a knife, and again had his genitals removed. However, this time there'd also been an attempt to remove the victim's head. Forensic examination later showed that the sixth body discovered was actually the fourth to have their life ended, a little over a week after the victim known as Luo Jun. The man referred to by the pseudonym Zhi Minghai was 30 years old, and had also been tied up for bondage play, and like the second victim had been party to a long drawn-out tortuous assault. Forensic examination found that the victim had suffered cigarette burns, shallow cuts, whipping, and blunt force trauma. The genitals had been removed, and the cause of death was multiple penetrating wounds from a knife. By early March the police had a fifth victim on their hands. This time the male victim was found in a men's public toilet. The 25-year-old, identified with the pseudonym Zheng Yuan, had been injured multiple times with a knife, but mercifully his body was left intact. The final victim found in the parkland by the river was referred to as Peng Chao, and was 21 at the time of his death. Brutal and sadistic as the assaults appeared, forensic examination of the bodies would only make them more chilling, when it was discovered that 3 of the victims had their manhood removed while they were still alive. Beijing investigators had long since linked the attacks together, and believed early on they were looking for the same man after the first 2 homicides. The assaults all bore similar trademarks, and the victims all had something in common. However, that would make investigating the case a difficult and delicate job. All 6 victims were gay, and with this knowledge the police had to walk a tightrope. Homosexuality was something people were rarely public about, even in a somewhat modern city like Beijing. Police found that all victims frequently attended gay bars in the city, that while not openly advertising themselves as gay bars, were well known in the community. The victims had also been users of the popular gay dating site Purple Boys. However, it was very unlikely that any of the men were open about their sexuality with family, straight friends, or colleagues. This meant police had to tread on eggshells when talking to people close to the victims, as they attempted to get information about potential suspects. Furthermore, members of the gay community in Beijing weren't overly keen on talking to the police, many having a distrust of them, others not wanting their secret to become wider public knowledge. While homosexuality had never technically been illegal in the country, gay people could be arrested under the somewhat vague and wide-ranging charge of Yulmang, which translates into hooliganism. The charge of hooliganism was brought into law in 1979, and covered things such as violating social morality, provoking fights, disrupting social order, adultery, and numerous other activities. How the law was enforced was down to individual police forces, and they arbitrarily decided what acts they considered to be against social morality. For example, unmarried couples sharing a hotel room could be arrested for hooliganism. Those arrested under the charge were often punished with the harshest possible sentences, and it was used during the infamous Yanda, or Strike Hard campaigns. Strike Hard campaigns were mass crackdowns in criminal activity across the country. Attempting to impress Beijing, police forces would use hooliganism to make their arrest numbers more impressive. Those arrested were subjected to mass public trials in order to shame the supposed offenders and show the police's effectiveness. Some police forces would use homosexuality as a reason to arrest people under the charge of hooliganism, claiming it to be adultery or against social morality. In 1997, after a number of questionable incidents with police using the hooliganism charge to falsely arrest and hold people in detention, the hooliganism law was abolished. Despite this change, many in the gay community were still extremely wary of the police. However, there were now 6 victims in little more than 2 months, and police believed there was an individual moving through the gay scene hunting down victims, brutally ending their lives. Investigators had already gone through the online activity of the men and found that 2 had been in contact with the same person, agreeing to meet shortly before their deaths, but the individual in question hadn't shared his personal information. Furthermore, it emerged from checking social media and phone activity that the first 4 victims were known to each other, so police focused on looking into their backgrounds, acquaintances, and the locales they frequented. Visiting gay bars the men hung out, police had to guarantee the anonymity of anyone willing to speak to them in attempts to get information. Most of those in the community were still in the closet, and in many cases would be part of heterosexual relationships in public, being married and having children. People didn't want to become involved in something that could potentially expose their private orientation to the people they knew who were unaware of it. But police would continue to impress the possible danger to their lives, and the importance of catching this maniac before they struck again. Eventually, by the beginning of April, the same name had been mentioned by several informants, that of a man called Li Yi Jiang. The 24-year-old, originally from Changji, a city in China's northwestern autonomous region Xinjiang, had come to Beijing in the year 2000 to study computer science at the Institute of Technology. However, he dropped out in his sophomore year and was now working for an insurance company in the city. Entering the community Li Yi Jiang was residing, police were slowly approached by a fairly tall, slim man walking his dog. As the man got closer, he held out his hands as if waiting for handcuffs to be placed on his wrist, calmly telling the officers, "I think you are looking for me." In the interrogation room, Li Yi Jiang casually confessed to the 6 homicides, but his motives would shock the interviewing officers. With the level of brutality displayed, especially in the first 4 assaults, police had come to the conclusion the person they were looking for had a hatred of gay men, likely because he was unable to accept his own homosexuality. But Li Yi Jiang gave them a much more disturbing story. Li Yi Jiang confessed that in the first 4 homicides he was motivated purely by revenge for what the victims inflicted on him a few months earlier. In the November of 2002, Li Yi Jiang went to a gay bar after recently breaking up with his boyfriend and got talking to the 4 men. The men would later be known by the names Wu Xiaogang, Liu Gui, Luo Jun, and Zhi Minghai. The 5 men danced and drank heavily together throughout the night, before Li Yi Jiang was invited back to one of their homes. He accepted the invitation, and they went to the apartment, continuing to drink, until Li Yi Jiang found himself unable to stay awake. Not knowing how long he'd been unconscious, Li Yi Jiang woke to find himself hanging naked by his arms from a heating pipe. The 4 men he'd previously been enjoying the night with stood in front of him laughing as he hung helplessly from the pipe. They then began subjecting their captive to all manner of abuse. He was whipped until skin split open, burned with cigarettes and candles. They used various items to violate him, and ordered him to bark like a dog for their amusement. Once they finally let him down, they then took turns repeatedly violating him, until they each eventually passed out, leaving a bleeding and sobbing Li Yi Jiang on the floor. Terrified and in agony, Li Yi Jiang waited until he was sure they were all sleeping, before slowly putting his clothes on, trying desperately not to wake his abusers with his groans of pain, and left the apartment. Getting back to his home, he broke down in tears, but the sadness soon gave way to fury, and Li Yi Jiang decided he would take revenge on the men, making them experience what they put him through, but he would show no mercy. He further confessed that his final two victims were just down to the anger he still felt towards the people that violated him. As shocked as police were by his story, it would only get more surprising when he confessed to a seventh homicide, committed 9 years prior, when he was only 15. Born in 1980, Li Yi Jiang was raised by his aunt who was living in Beijing, while his parents remained in their hometown of Changji in Xinjiang. His aunt had agreed to raise him, as his mother suffered from mental health issues, which significantly worsened after his birth. At the time there was a stigma surrounding people who displayed clear mental health problems, and no real system in place for people to be properly diagnosed and treated. Issues were either ignored, or people turned to traditional Chinese medicine in attempts to treat or cure the condition. Practitioners of TCM often claiming the problems were caused by imbalances in the individual's qi. However, when still a child, his aunt experienced significant health issues herself, and as a result Li Yi Jiang was sent back to his parents in Changji. Li Yi Jiang had been happy with his life in Beijing, but that changed dramatically when he returned to his parents' home. His mother's undiagnosed condition would cause her to frequently fly into violent rages, for no apparent reason, and Li Yi Jiang became the main focus of her outbursts. He'd receive regular beatings from her, often being dragged out of bed while sleeping. She'd get on top of him as he was on the ground, attempting to smother him until his father intervened. His father did what he could to provide for the family, working multiple jobs, and tried to cope with his wife's condition. But with Li Yi Jiang home, and his wife's rages getting more frequent since their son's return, he eventually cracked under the pressure, descending into alcoholism. A once hard-working man transformed into a violent, abusive drunk, targeting his anger at his wife. The young Li Yi Jiang would have to step in when his parents began fighting, the child trying to protect his mother from his father's anger, on more than one occasion grabbing a knife to fend the man off. This inevitably led to his father directing his violent beatings towards Li Yi Jiang, the young boy becoming a victim of physical assaults from both his parents. School became a safe haven for the boy, but it was also where he began to realize he was different from many of his peers. In middle school he developed romantic feelings for another boy in his class. The two had a friendly relationship, but Li Yi Jiang wanted more, and believed the boy felt the same way. He confessed his feelings to his classmate, but was swiftly rejected, the object of his affection slapping him in the face and calling him "儿子." The term "儿子," which can be translated to mean two tails or two chairs, is a derogatory term in northern China, used to refer to a person who is neither male or female, originating from a term to describe the eunuchs who served the royal courts in the past. The boy told other students about Li Yi Jiang, and soon he became the target of bullies, and faced regular humiliation, his once safe haven now being little different from his life at home. Now instead of being infatuated with his crush, he saw his father in the boy, and an anger began bubbling up inside him. 10 days later a 15-year-old Li Yi Jiang unleashed that anger. Waiting for an opportunity outside of school, he followed the boy to a quiet location and attacked him with a knife, injuring his now former crush more than 20 times, ending his life. When police investigated the 15-year-old's death, other students informed them that the victim had quarreled with Li Yi Jiang, leading the police to interview him. However, Li Yi Jiang came off as being very calm, showing no fear when the police spoke to him, and gave off no indication that he was involved at all. When police spoke to teachers and students about him, they all said Li Yi Jiang was just a quiet kid, a good student who never displayed any aggressive tendencies. Everyone who knew him just saw him as a regular 15-year-old boy, not the normal suspect for a brutal, frenzied homicidal attack. The dispute between the victim and Li Yi Jiang was just put down as a normal everyday falling out between teenagers, nothing that could lead to a homicide. With no witnesses, and no evidence to help police track down a suspect, the case would go down as unsolved, until Li Yi Jiang would confess to it almost 10 years later. Desperate to escape his miserable life in Changji, Li Yi Jiang put all of his energies into his studies, hoping that he'd be able to gain admission to university, and return to the only place he'd ever felt happiness, Beijing. Unfortunately, that was a few years off, and in the meantime the city of Changji would force even more misery on him, before he had the chance to escape. One evening, not long after the incident with his classmate, he was walking home from school alone. As he walked, an older man approached him, and the two had a conversation which culminated with the older man inviting Li Yi Jiang to join him for dinner at his home. Perhaps because it was someone showing him some level of kindness, Li Yi Jiang naively accepted the man's invitation, but it would result in him being violated by the older individual. He wouldn't tell anyone about the assault, instead letting the anger fester. Li Yi Jiang from then on carried a knife with him at all times, hoping to run into the man once more, wanting to exact the same punishment he gave his classmate. But their paths never crossed again. Li Yi Jiang eventually got what he'd long been hoping for in his final year of high school, achieving a good enough score in the college entrance exam to be admitted into the Beijing Institute of Technology, allowing him to leave Changji behind, with no intention of returning. He chose computer science as his major, his life seemingly beginning to be somewhat normal, for the first time in many years. The feelings of being safe and happy were emotions he hadn't experienced since leaving the city as a child. At university, he had no problems making a good impression on his fellow students from the start, and was quickly able to make friends. Former classmates of his recalled him being an especially friendly, easygoing individual, keen to make friends with everyone in the class. He rarely talked about his hometown or family, apart from mentioning a fight that took place in middle school. Assuming there were some issues in his past, friends respected his unwillingness to talk about it. Surprisingly, for someone of that age, he was said to be a talented chef, impressing his dorm mates when he cooked for them. By the time his second year came around, his family were struggling to come up with the money to pay his tuition fees. Consequently, Li Yi Jiang took a part-time job at a local branch of KFC. His friends were concerned that he'd do 2 shifts a day while studying at the same time, one in the morning before lectures, then another in the evening. But they also noted how he always dressed well, wearing much more fashionable clothes than other students, so they assumed he did the extra work to pay for this. While he'd attempted to hide the fact he was gay because of his experience in middle school, many of his college friends had long suspected it, and had those suspicions confirmed when Li Yi Jiang felt comfortable enough to come out to them. Li Yi Jiang was tall, fairly athletic, dressed well, and was a friendly, outgoing person, so didn't have much trouble attracting the attention of female students. One young woman, who was a target for a number of other male students, seemingly had her sights set on Li Yi Jiang. She would frequently look for him around the college, bringing him gifts, but Li Yi Jiang seemed completely uninterested. Thinking it strange that a young man would rebuff the advances of a woman so obviously attracted to him, friends half-jokingly asked if he was gay, and Li Yi Jiang eventually admitted he was. However, this time there was no name-calling or bullying. His friends simply accepted it, and treated him no differently than they did before. Li Yijiang felt more comfortable being honest with his friends in no small part due to being in a larger, more modern, open-minded city. While it was still a time when being openly gay wasn't fully accepted, older generations and those of a more traditional mindset believing homosexuality was a mental illness, Beijing had a thriving underground gay community which Li Yijiang quickly discovered. There were cafes, bars, and nightclubs, which catered to the community, as well as bathhouses across the city. A common sight was also people leaving their telephone numbers or social media ID names on the walls of public bathrooms. Those not wanting to be so public about their orientation would connect online, on the social media app QQ or using the Purple Boys website. Unlike in Changji, there were plenty of people in the local area willing to meet up. Li Yijiang finally felt he'd found a community that accepted him, and he made the most of enjoying the nightlife the city had to offer. He went out to bars on an almost nightly basis, and would eventually meet a man identified by the pseudonym Tang Mo. Tang Mo was what would become referred to as a fu'erdai, meaning rich second generation. A child with wealthy parents who lived off their money, without trying to achieve anything themselves. The term became a somewhat derogatory way to describe a child of a nouveau riche family. They'd make sure to show off their parents' wealth to everyone around them, and would eventually take over the family businesses when their parents decided to retire. Tang Mo had followed a fairly stereotypical path of a fu'erdai, graduating from one of the top universities in Beijing, and having parents seemingly willing to support him financially, while he enjoyed his youth rather than wasted working. The two met in a nightclub, and soon entered into a relationship, with Tang Mo saying he was willing to help out Li Yijiang financially. Experiencing the more hedonistic lifestyle Tang Mo enjoyed, Li Yijiang quickly grew bored with his college life and dropped out, Tang Mo giving him enough money to start up a small clothes store in a clothing market. He'd return to the campus on occasion to see his college friends, inviting them out for dinner or to enjoy the city's nightlife. They noticed he was wearing even more expensive clothes, and took them out to high-end restaurants, always picking up the tab, so they assumed his business was doing well. Tang Mo would also give him advice about being a member of the gay community, by telling him to have a more acceptable public persona. With homophobic views being fairly common in older generations, and being openly gay rare, many people hid their sexuality, especially to family. It was often difficult for people to rent apartments or business premises if they were openly gay or found out to be so. Then there was pressure from parents for people to get married and start having families, sometimes actually organizing a form of arranged marriage, with two families agreeing to try and marry their sons and daughters off to each other. This would lead people to enter into more socially accepted relationships, many getting married and having children while suppressing their true feelings. The terms tongqi and tongfu being coined to describe a gay man's wife or gay woman's husband. To deal with this, gay men and lesbians would present themselves as girlfriend and boyfriend to prevent the family from losing face, while they carried on with their private lives behind closed doors. Tang Mo advised Li Yijiang to find a woman he could have a public relationship with, to avoid discrimination. Li Yijiang started a relationship with a young straight woman who worked at another stall in the clothes market. However, an incident between them would trigger traumatic feelings from his childhood. One evening together, the woman attempted to initiate intercourse between them for the first time. Getting on top of him, she pressed him into the bed, which immediately brought back memories of his mother trying to smother him as a child. He forcefully pushed the woman off him to the floor and began having a panic attack. Memories of his abusive childhood flooding his mind. When he recovered, he threw her clothes at her, screaming that she needed to leave. He later apologized, and at least tried to explain why he reacted that way, albeit without going into too much detail, and the couple attempted to continue the relationship, her unaware of his real feelings. But she perhaps slowly began to realize the truth when he wouldn't show any interest in being intimate. The sham relationship ended when he came to her home and walked in on her in bed with another man. It wouldn't be long after this his relationship with Tang Mo broke down. While he knew Tang Mo enjoyed a playboy type of life, he had considered them to be in an exclusive relationship, but Tang Mo felt differently, and soon enough grew bored of Li Yi Jiang and moved on to other partners. The breakup of the first romantic relationship he'd experienced hurt Li Yi Jiang, and he began drinking heavily, cruising gay bars on a nightly basis, and this would soon introduce him to the four men known as Wu Xiaogang, Liu Gui, Luo Jun, and Zhi Minghai. Getting home after the brutal prolonged assault he'd been subject to, Li Yi Jiang, furious and sick of being a victim, vowed to hunt down the four men and exact revenge, just as he'd done to his classmate 9 years earlier. In early January 2003, Wu Xiaogang was sat in an internet cafe, looking through the dating site Purple Boys, unaware he was being watched by Li Yi Jiang. After a couple of hours, Wu Xiaogang stood up to go use the toilet. Li Yi Jiang took the opportunity to go to the computer and noted down the username his target used on the social network QQ. A few days later, Wu Xiaogang, whose QQ ID was Toll Slave, was unknowingly sent a friend request by Li Yi Jiang. The two chatted a while, making it clear what their interests were, and came to an agreement. Wu Xiaogang would pay Li Yi Jiang 800 yuan, about $96 for the evening. The meeting was arranged to take place at the home of Wu Xiaogang when he'd be alone, giving them some privacy. Opening his door to Li Yi Jiang, Wu Xiaogang recognized him and was somewhat shocked to see the man standing in front of him. Seeing a look of concern cross the face of Wu Xiaogang, Li Yi Jiang was quick to reassure him that he actually enjoyed their previous time together and wanted to do something similar. Wu Xiaogang turned and guided Li Yi Jiang into his home, handing over the money. As he began getting undressed, the moment he turned away, Li Yi Jiang attacked with his knife, wounding his abuser several times in the back. Wu Xiaogang fell to the floor bleeding out, but Li Yi Jiang wasn't finished exacting his revenge for his humiliation. Wu Xiaogang was made to watch as his genitals were removed. Li Yi Jiang then went to a window, saying he was going to feed the parts to the stray dogs outside, and threw them out of the window into a garbage dump below. He took out the 800 yuan they'd agreed to as payment for the evening, and threw it on the floor, believing his revenge was payment enough. He waited and watched until Wu Xiaogang took his last breath before leaving the apartment. With one down, he had 3 to go. He started prowling the city's gay bars for his prey, and it wouldn't be long before he found number 2. Only a few days later, he spotted Liu Gui in a nightclub. As with Wu Xiaogang, Liu Gui recognized him, and was wary of the reason Li Yi Jiang was approaching him. Again, Li Yi Jiang managed to reassure his target that there were no hard feelings, and after talking for a while, Liu Gui suggested they could go back to his place and have some fun, after Li Yi Jiang mentioned he'd been short of money recently. The two left and went to the apartment of Liu Gui. Once there, Li Yi Jiang suggested that this time he could tie up Liu Gui, to which his target excitedly consented. Once Liu Gui was bound and gagged, Li Yi Jiang exacted his revenge. He took his time punishing Liu Gui in much the same way he'd been abused, using a whip, cigarettes, and cutting him with the knife. The ball gag keeping the screams of Liu Gui from alerting neighbors. When he was satisfied, Li Yi Jiang again made his victim watch as he removed their manhood, before slowly and carefully slicing the throat of Liu Gui. The next target Li Yi Jiang tracked down was Luo Jun, little more than a week later. Police were investigating the incidents with the first 2 victims, but hadn't yet made the connection between the 2 men, as family and friends weren't fully aware of their private lives. In much the same way as he'd done with Wu Xiaogang, he found Luo Jun in an internet cafe. Once more, he waited for an opportunity to get a look at the QQ ID name, which this time was handsome guy with beautiful feet. After a few conversations online, Li Yi Jiang offered his services for a fee, saying he was interested in S&M and bondage. Luo Jun agreed to the price, inviting Li Yi Jiang to his home. Li Yi Jiang was shocked when Luo Jun didn't recognize him at all. Li Yi Jiang felt his abuse was completely insignificant to his abuser, further enraging him. He vented his fury on Luo Jun as soon as the door closed behind them. He lashed out with his knife, repeatedly thrusting it into Luo Jun until his life was extinguished. Once he'd calmed, he then removed his victim's genitals, before making an attempt to remove the head of Luo Jun, ultimately giving up and leaving. With 3 down, there was 1 more left, the man Li Yi Jiang considered the ringleader, Zhi Minghai, who'd been directing the abuse that was inflicted onto him. The 3 bodies had been discovered by police, and investigation started. It quickly became apparent that the victims were part of the gay community, and the manner of their deaths pointed to the incidents being down to the same individual, or individuals. However, getting help with their inquiries from others in the gay community was proving difficult, given people's unwillingness to talk to the police, and the close connection between the 3 men had yet to be unearthed. The 4 didn't communicate with each other often, outside of meeting up in bars, so since the death of Wu Xiaogang, the others were unaware of what was happening, until Li Yi Jiang had them at his mercy. So when Li Yi Jiang found Zhi Minghai in a gay bar one night, his tormentor was oblivious to what Li Yi Jiang had been doing during the previous weeks. In the mind of Li Yi Jiang, he'd inadvertently saved the revenge he was going to enjoy the most, till last. He described Zhi Minghai as a middle-aged man with a fat head and big ears, and remembered he'd been the one telling the other men what to do to him while he was strung up on the heating pipe. Li Yi Jiang was recognized by his target this time, but again any concerns were washed away when Li Yi Jiang said he was looking to make some money, and wanted to learn more about the bondage scene. At the home of Zhi Minghai, Li Yi Jiang asked if he could play the dominant role this time, and Zhi Minghai agreed, guiding Li Yi Jiang on how to bind him. Once his prey was secured, Li Yi Jiang made his intentions abundantly clear. He got the terrified Zhi Minghai to confess he'd drugged him that night, to make him pass out. Li Yi Jiang punished his captive in the same way he'd been abused, finishing him off by forcing Zhi Minghai to witness the removal of his own genitals, before Li Yi Jiang ended his life, leaving him to rot, until the body was discovered by his mother. He'd finally received the vengeance he believed he deserved, but it didn't extinguish the anger built up in Li Yi Jiang since childhood. And he'd come to enjoy the feeling of power punishing his terrified victims gave him. The feeling of power, rather than the fear of being a victim, became addictive, and he found himself unable to stop. But with no direct targets to hunt down, he turned to random attacks. Seeing more police investigating the city's gay bars, he began looking for victims in other spots gay men were known to frequent. Days after his assault on Zhi Minghai, Li Yi Jiang hung around a men's public toilet, waiting for someone unlucky enough to proposition him. A man who'd later be identified under the pseudonym Zheng Yuan entered the bathroom and made the mistake of talking to Li Yi Jiang, making it clear what he'd come to the toilet for. Li Yi Jiang attacked him, injuring him numerous times in a frenzied assault. Forensic examination of the victim would later show many of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Mercifully, this time Li Yi Jiang made no attempt to mutilate his victim, leaving after he was sure the man was dead. Despite the differences in the incident, with 3 bodies of gay men having been found at this time, the case was linked to the other deaths. Days later there would be another incident in a public toilet. However, this time the person attacked by Li Yi Jiang had an opportunity to fight back, managing to escape with only minor injuries. However, given the circumstances of the attempt on his life, the victim wouldn't come forward to police about the attack, until news of the arrest of Li Yi Jiang was made public. If it had been reported, it might have prevented the final assault that would take place along the banks of the Yongding River. Again, it would be another random incident, with no prior relationship between the victim Peng Chao and Li Yi Jiang. Concerned that now there'd be a police presence near public bathrooms, Li Yi Jiang moved on to another hunting ground, parkland which the Yongding River ran through. Li Yi Jiang would again attack the man numerous times with his knife, then wait around to watch his victim take his last breath, before leaving the scene, without inflicting the further punishment he had on other victims. Li Yi Jiang openly confessed everything to police during his interrogation, admitting that he gave himself up, because he doubted his ability to stop his rampage. He told police he loved men, but had also grown to hate them. He compared himself to the character Lai Yu from the 2001 movie of the same name, which told a tragic love story between a university student from a poor rural area and wealthy Beijing businessman. In his eyes, the only difference in the tragedies they both experienced was he took the lives of those who wronged him, while the character Lai Yu did not. He knew the death penalty was facing him, but said he didn't fear his future punishment. There was no expression of remorse for his actions, believing that most of his victims fully deserved their fates. At no time did he ever contemplate going to the police about the assault he suffered, feeling the 4 men who abused him deserved a punishment far worse than prison. But he would admit to occasionally having doubts if it was the right thing to do. On April 28, 2004, Li Yi Jiang appeared in court to hear his sentence. He was handed the death penalty and said he had no intention to appeal the verdict. His final words to the judge were a simple thank you. Shortly before his punishment was carried out, his parents came from Changji to see him one last time. It was the first time he'd see them since he left to study in Beijing. His mother, still suffering with her mental health issues, had to be sedated before they came face to face, in efforts to keep her mood stable. Li Yi Jiang had little to say to them, apart from telling his father not to beat his mother anymore. His mother barely seemed to realize where she was or what was happening. Li Yi Jiang told her not to worry about him, and that he wouldn't be able to see her again, because he was going to study overseas. Li Yi Jiang was executed for his 7 intentional homicides on August 20, 2004. After the execution, when reporters spoke to former classmates of Li Yi Jiang, they were genuinely stunned at what he'd done, and struggled to comprehend how the person they once knew was capable of committing such horrifying crimes. In their eyes, he was a smart, easygoing guy, who was happy to be friends with everyone he met. He never displayed any negative or antisocial personality traits. They only wished Li Yi Jiang came to them after what happened, so they could try and help someone they considered a truly good friend, and not the monster he became. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.